This video we're going to do the cast on rag method. So we're going to show you how to make these cast on rags. There's a few different ways we can do that. The cast on rag method you always use with some ravel cord in order to quickly release the rag from the work. So as an overview, this is all acrylic yarn that I've steamed to lay flat. So the first method we can cover is a simple cast on, knit straight, and a behind the gate peg cast off in order to give us these holes. Another easier method, we use a bias technique, and that automatically forms our eyelets for us. And the best thing about a cast on rag is if you have any oddments, there's no reason why you can't create a cast on rag with all your oddments of yarn. If you're not sure, if it's only a small amount and you're not sure what you want to put it into project wise, it's not enough really for a decent sized project, just make a cast on rag. You can see this one here, I've just used all the little odd bits of waste yarn in order to create a full size for the full width of the bed. You can make these any size that you want, full width of the bed, a specific size. Say if you make a lot of gloves and you always need a 60 stitch cast on, then you can make a 65 or a 66 stitch rag. So let's get on and do some knitting. So our first method of cast on rag that we're going to do is just the simple cast on, knit straight, cast off. So I've reset my row counter, my carriage is set to plain, and I'm going to pull forward 15 stitches for this sample, but you can pull forward as many as you want for the size of rag that you want to use. I already have my machine threaded up here, so I'm going to pull out some excess yarn so that I'm not fighting the tension spring in the mast system. I always like to place a peg on the end of my yarn, and I start on the left hand side working towards the carriage. So I'm going to come into the space between needle 1 and 2 on the left, and I'm going to counterclockwise wrap and use my left index finger to control the yarn. So every time what we're doing is we're coming up onto the right side of the needle we want to wrap, laying the yarn over, coming down to the left side and letting the yarn wrap that needle. You don't want to make these wraps too tight, otherwise they can either cause a jam in the carriage, or if you try to force the carriage, it may break the yarn depending on what fibre type you're using. So we never want to force the carriage, because we'll either break the yarn or we'll break the carriage or a needle. And once you're at the end, we're just going to go across and thread up our carriage, and then we're going to pull back through the slack, back through the tension system, so when my carriage is this far over, as I'm bringing the carriage towards the start of the needles, look up at your take up spring and make sure that it has enough tension in there. If you're not sure, then I always recommend that you give the yarn a few tugs at the top of the cone so that the tension spring comes closer to the mast system. Otherwise, you can always use your hand to hand tension as you're pushing the carriage to the work. Your other hand will be pulling the yarn up away from the carriage to take up the slack in this area here. So we have our first row. We now want to be able to knit our second row. So what I recommend to do is to place a flat edge. So I'm just taking the flat edge of my needle pushing tool, laying it against the sinker posts but on top of the formed stitches, and I'm going to apply gentle pressure as I pull out the needles. And we're ready to do our second row. So I always recommend, if it's not a machine that you're used to, or it can be quite a temperamental machine when it casts on, then I always recommend that you do this for the first 3 or 4 passes of the carriage. That way then you're not going to cause any looping or dropped stitches at the very beginning. And once you have enough fabric, you can decide whether or not at this point you want to put some claw weights onto the edges of the work, or whether you want to do a few more passes pulling the needles out every time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to knit 20 rows and see how the height of this piece of fabric we're creating looks. Now I've done my 20 rows, I think that would be more than sufficient of a piece of fabric. I could even probably get away with doing less than that for this type of yarn, but this is a cotton yarn, so I'll wait to see how the fabric steams. So now I'm ready to do the cast off section, and the cast off I'm going to use is a behind the gate peg cast off. So when we're ready to start the behind the gate peg cast off, what we're going to do is unthread our carriage, and again I'm going to pull through some slack from the tension mast so that I'm not constantly fighting the take up spring, and I can control the tension of each stitch I'm forming more easily. So I need my single prong transfer tool, and I'm going to start where the working yarn is. On this case is on the right hand side. I'm going to take this stitch, rather than transfer it how we would normally do for a decrease, we would come in front. We're going to try and make sure that we take that stitch behind the gate peg. And then place that stitch onto the next needle, lay the yarn across and manually knit that stitch through. And we're doing the same process of steps every time. We're going to take that stitch on the right off Make sure that we go behind the gate peg onto the next needle, lay the yarn across and knit the stitch through. Now, depending on the type of yarn you're using, if it's splitty or perhaps multi-stranded, then you might prefer to manually close the latch before you knit the stitch through. So at this point here, I can lay my yarn across and I can manually close that latch before I pull the needle back. You can see a little bit of a different angle here. What we're going to do is take this needle off and make sure that we place the transfer tool behind the gate peg. Place onto the next needle. And manually knit that stitch. And you're going to do that all the way across the needles you have selected. Once you've reached the end and you've done your final transfer behind the gate peg, manually knit that stitch, and just for security I normally prefer to knit that through again. I can cut the yarn at this point. With that last loop that we pulled through, just pull that tail through to secure the last stitch. The piece hasn't dropped off of the machine because we have it secured on the gate pegs, so we can just lift this up off of the gate pegs, and then we can show at the end the final stage when we steam each sample. So our second technique, which is to create the bias strip, it's very simple, that you only bring out 10 needles. Normally you would start this at the end or the left hand side of your machine and work your way along. But since this is just to demonstrate, we'll just start in this as close to the centre. So I'm going to do the exact same method here, just with not as many needles. I'm going to place on the tail of the yarn peg and E-wrap these 10 needles. Thread the carriage and then pull down the slack through the tension unit. So once we're ready to knit our first row, We'll do that. And again, we're going to come in with the flat edge of our needle pushing tool, hold it against the stitches and pull the needles forward. And then our second row. Once we've done that, we're going to come in on the left hand side, take this edge stitch, transfer it in front of the sinker post or gate peg, transfer it over, pull this all the way out, push the empty needle out of work. Then we're going to take the right hand edge needle, again in front of the gate peg, and transfer that onto the adjacent needle. So we decrease on the left, increase on the right. Make sure that this empty needle on the right stays in work. Whether you want to pull each transfer needle all the way forward is entirely your preference. So you can either pull all of these forward or just start to knit. So we're going to do 2 rows. And you may be able to see here the first eyelet that forms. So you continue moving the left edge needle over by 1, push the empty needle out of work, the right edge needle over by 1, and we're always moving in the same direction. Ensure that empty needle stays in work. 2 rows. Now at this point, I think I'll hang a claw weight. And again, you can create what would effectively be the depth of the cast on rag here. Because we're knitting it sideways and biasing, the depth of the rag depends on how many needles you work on the machine. So I have 10, but you might prefer to do 15 or 20. And you want to make sure that you work to the number of needles that you want the cast on rag to cover. So bear in mind that every 2 rows, so my row counter here says 6, but I only have 2 usable eyelets here. So say you want a cast on rag to cover 50 needles, then effectively you would need 100 rows. Because we're only creating 1 eyelet for every 2 rows of the passing of the carriage. And if you find that you want to create a full bed cast on rag, then the depending on the number of needles that you start with, if you start on the far left hand side of the bed, then that means you won't have 100 needles for the length of the cast on rag, because you'll be 10 needles short, or however many you use in the beginning. So you will have to transfer the work at some point back to the far left. And you could effectively double up. So you could make your cast on rag more than your 200 needle width of your main bed, because you might want to use it for knitting circular on your ribber as well. So you can see here I forgot to put the empty needle on the right in work. So I'm just going to lift that bar . So once we're ready, you have the length of the rag that you want for the preferred number of eyelets. We're then ready to cast off. Now you can cast off in the same way that we did with the previous method, or you can do a latch tool cast off. It has to be some form of a closed cast off. So what I'll do is I'll show the latch tool cast off. I've unthreaded my carriage. I'm laying the working yarn into the hooks of the needles, and then I'm going to push these needles back so that the latches want to close, and then I'm going to manually knit back each needle. And then once I'm happy with the sizes that I've created for each stitch, I can bring these forward. It's up to you if you want to remove the weights. And because this is such a short piece, I'm just going to place a peg on this end few needles so that the edge of the work isn't going to accidentally drop off of the machine. And I'm going to come on to the right hand side and pull off the first loop, place it behind the latch on my latch tool, go into the second loop, pull that off of the needle, and pull the loop that was behind the latch over the loop that's in the hook. And again, you're going to place the stitch on the tool behind the latch into the next stitch, pull that through. And I'm just controlling with my thumb and index finger on my right hand the stitches where they move to. And when you're on the final few needles, just make sure that you use your index finger to control these last few stitches so that they don't accidentally drop off. Make sure that first stitch goes behind the latch on your tool. Pull it through. And then once you're done, you can just do a final pull through and cut the yarn and pull that tail through. Pull that tight, and that secures your cast off. So the final step you want to do before the rag is easy to use is to steam each one. So here we have the one that we did flat, and here you can see the one with the bias, and you can see why you might want to steam this flat. So I'm just going to do a little bit of quick prep and pin this. So my iron's been sitting to the side preheating. I'm just going to come in, hover and steam. With the piece steamed, I can now take the pins out. That is now ready to be used. So we can see on the top here, where the column of V stitches comes up, is where we have our little holes. So you can press this more, it depends on the fibre. This one I've been using a cotton yarn. I'm just going to come in and lightly press this. Just so that it defines more the holes in the top. Then we can come on to our bias strip. And I'm just going to pin this to try and tame this curl that it wants to do on the bottom. And again, come in with the iron. Give this a steam. Let the piece cool slightly, so we don't want to burn ourselves on the metal pins here. And we can take out all of the pins. And then you can see it lays much flatter now that it's had a little bit of steam. And you can trim these tails because we've done a closed cast on and cast off method. So we're going to show you how easy it is on the machine to place this on and use the ravel cord. So normally whenever we're doing any cast on rag, I recommend you pull forward the needles. You use a latch opening tool, which just looks like a credit card with the slot cut in it. Run this in the hooks to open the latches, and then it's just a case of laying the rag onto the needles. Hang some weight. I would recommend that you tuck the edges out of the way before you hang the weight, and then you can do your row of ravel cord, and then you have something to hang weights onto to control the stitches from your garment. So that was the bias strip. Here is the straight strip. So again, we want to open the latches, and we want to offer the rag to the machine, and again tuck the edges, hang your weights, and do your row of ravel cord. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video. Feel free to leave a comment, and until the next time, you've been watching Buttonmouse the Wee Machine Knitter.